What is happening, everybody? So, I wanted to chat with you guys about really how much farther can the naturally aspirated pony cars go? And what I mean by that is when you look at the horsepower that these modern engines are producing, you almost have to stand in awe in relation to a perspective from maybe a historical standpoint from cars from the 60s and early 70s. But even cars from just, I don't know, 7 to 10 years ago. Look at it like this. Cars have come so far as efficiency, power, and just specific output per liter. They've come so far beyond what was considered legendary from the late 60s and early 70s. And really, when you look at it from that point of view, you almost wonder, well, really, how much farther can it go? Because, well, consider this. The LT1, it's making 455 horsepower. That's a 370-ish cubic inch engine that's making 455 horsepower. To get that type of power out of an old school or traditional small block would require a ton of work. And a car with that much work done to it in that architecture you're probably going to find it to be not necessarily the most streetable of all engines. So the amount of technology that is put into these engines of today to get them to the power and the efficiency that they provide, it's amazing to me. So, this conversation will come up sometimes between myself and some friends, and it basically goes like this. You've got the Mustang at what will, I'm sure, be somewhere near 455 horsepower with the 2018 Mustang GT. You've got 455 horsepower coming from the 6.2 liter in the Camaros and, of course, the Corvette. And, yes, the 485 horsepower coming from the 6.4 392. Well, really, how much farther can you go with the naturally aspirated platform? Now, what I look to, obvious choice, first look is going to be something like the Voodoo engine in the GT350. That engine's 5.2 liters and it's making, 530 plus horsepower. And to me, that is a pretty amazing number. And I get that there's other engines that have higher specific horsepower outputs. A lot of European stuff does, but they're not as big as the 5.2, and that's kind of more to the point. I'm really not even talking about the stuff from Europe. I'm talking about good old-fashioned American hot rods. And really, I guess, the question is, well, if they can go farther, how much farther can they go? Say, for example, with the 392. It's always been known that the 392 received a different intake than the 6.1, especially a different intake design with it being a dual runner to give it both good low-end response and better top-end horsepower, but it's not the best intake in the world for that engine. All these cars with variable runner intakes and variable cams and all of the different gizmos and gadgets that it takes to get these types of power figures out of those engines, well, there's always some level of compromise that you have to make to get a streetable engine to make that kind of power. Well, I guess I'm curious as to how far can it really go and how much bigger can the engines get and still be efficient. Well, let me just say economical on the street. Efficiency, I think they've got down pat. But I don't know, getting back to the point, this is where all this conversation comes from. If you look at the engines from the late 60s and early 70s, even if you take the gross horsepower numbers to heart, the interesting thing is when you would see one of those cars on a dyno, you talk about not wanting to meet your hero and being let down in some way. Well, it's not uncommon for those engines back then that were rated at 375 up to 450 horsepower to only put down somewhere between 260 to maybe 330, 340 horsepower to the wheels. And that's out of a big block. And yeah, you might say, well, the torque would have been high too. Well, not really. Horsepower numbers are fairly low because the torque made at that RPM was fairly low. They just weren't that efficient. Transmissions weren't that efficient either, you might say. Well, Yeah, but this is also including 4 speed. So it's that argument's starting to not hold water. And let me put this into perspective. Let's say, and an engine I want to bring up was there was a guy with a 454 Chevelle 4 speed car. If I'm not mistaken, it made somewhere around 330 horsepower to the wheels. The original Coyote, when it was released, was making 415 horsepower, if memory serves me correct. I remember seeing those things on a dyno laying down 365 horsepower. And that's to the wheels, and that's eclipsing the legends of the late 60s and early 70s. So, really, we've gone past the legendary status in terms of power production, real power production, let alone power production to the rear wheels. Now, take that again a step farther, and it almost begs the question. I mean, are we living in another golden era? Well, of course we are. I mean, look at the power that we're able to produce out of much smaller engines. And when you do start getting closer to that 400 cubic inch level, not only are we making more than 425 horsepower, we're making almost 500 horsepower out of an engine that will knock down fairly decent fuel mileage. And to get there, it takes a lot of gizmos, a lot of gadgets, and a lot of computer work to get those engines as efficient as they are. To me, you lose a little bit of that romance, and you lose the ability to really work on the car yourself and do the mods yourself. But you know, the other side of that argument is look how good they already are. It doesn't really need too much work done to it, being any of the engines, 6.2, 6.4, or the 5.0. They don't really require too much work to get even more power out of them, but you'll never see that big 100 and something horsepower jump with like a head swap or maybe a cam and an exhaust. That's just not going to get you there. It's already very well optimized. So I guess I'm kind of getting a bit circular with the chat here, but I'm just wondering how much farther the naturally aspirated V8s can go. And if I were to venture a guess, I would say that the naturally aspirated V8s are probably going to cap out somewhere around 500 horsepower. It's more or less physics at that point. You can only eke so much power out of so much fuel and so much economy out of the same amount of fuel under normal driving conditions. But I'm sure there were guys like me that were asking this question that would have said that the 400 horsepower mark would be about the best that you could ever hope for. And we've gone about 100 horsepower past that with the 392. So who knows? Could be much higher than that 500 horsepower-ish number, but I'm just not so sure. And that 500 horsepower number that I'm talking about, well, I'm talking about the 392, and that engine is slated to be discontinued, which the latest rumor now is around 2021, and it's going to be replaced, the rumor has it, with that 2.9 liter 500 horse Alfa Romeo platform out of the Giulia. Well, if that is the case, then now we're left with only a couple of V8s to work with, and that's anything from GM and Ford. Well, again, there's going to be that top level that you can get to, that glass ceiling, so to speak, before there are no real gains. Basically, that whole law of marginal utility starts to come in, where no matter how much more work you put into that platform, you're basically at the max of what it will produce. And that's a shame, really, because I don't know, I would love to see this horsepower war just keep going on. And I'm really not talking about the supercharged cars, the halo or statement cars like the Hellcat, the ZL1, and if it will ever be released, the GT500. Those cars really don't come into play here. What I'm really talking about is naturally aspirated V8 muscle cars that we're able to enjoy still to this day. I'm curious how much longer that day is going to last, though, and I'm really more curious as to what the swan song will bring. Could we possibly see, I don't know, maybe another 426 Hemi in the future? I'd love to see that. I'd be first in line with my checkbook. How much farther can that Coyote platform go? Do they just abandon it altogether and stick with the Voodoo? That would be a kick, especially if you own a Camaro. Now you've got something that's hovering around 500 horsepower that anybody can buy for around 35 or 40 grand. Well, and that brings up another topic. At what point does the horsepower war get to where it's almost, well, irresponsible to sell to a price point to the general public? Again, a lot of folks like me would have said, listen, you might want to hold off at somewhere around 400 horsepower. Gives you a good, solid, safe power to weight ratio that will still be sporty, performance oriented. Basically cap it at mid 12s. Well, basically, you've got Challengers that on a tire will run 11s bone stock. You've got Camaros that will run 11s basically bone stock with that automatic, and Mustangs are not too far behind. Really, where does that point come to play? That mom point, that nanny point that will say, you've had enough, time to step away from the table. Wonder if that has something to do or some way to play into the conversation as well. But at any rate, I'd love to hear your comments. I'd love to get your opinions on the subject. Post up and let me know where you think this is going to end, or if you think that we're basically only scratching the surface and that this is just going to keep going. Hey, I don't know. I'm just a dude sitting in a chair chatting about it. Definitely no expert. Love to hear your comments though. And that's a wrap. Adios.